So ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce probably the foremost expert on culture, not only in the U.S. and not only in the educational sector, but we draw upon Anthony's work for all the sectors we work in, which is behavioral health, juvenile justice, child welfare, education, community-based organizations. We draw upon Anthony's work to help us navigate this very interesting dynamic called culture. So Anthony, give us kind of your definition and what culture includes and how we can examine it from the perspectives that you have over the years.
Well, thanks, Rick. I will do that. But first, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to this forum. And for everybody who's tuned into the webinar, I am very grateful that during this time of the pandemic and social unrest that you took the time to listen to little old me. And I'm just kind of thrilled that you're willing to do that. And I also want to say that Kids at Hope is a top-notch research-based organization. And anybody listening that has any authority, whether you're in schools, whether you're with the juvenile justice system or some other sector, but if you're not a partner with Kids at Hope, I would encourage you, because if you care about justice, you care about human progress, the Kids at Hope organization and their center at their Arizona State University is top-notch, and you should be a part of that movement if you're not. So I just wanted to give that plug. But to address the issue of culture, I'd like to, Rick, if you don't mind, if I kind of give the folks a history of my journey to studying culture. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Please.
And that will give them a better understanding of what culture is. I was a teacher for 8 years. I taught middle school social studies, and I loved it. And the rumor is that the age that you teach is the best representation of your maturity, or where you are as a person. So I guess I'm just a big adolescent at heart. I love teaching middle schoolers. Most people don't, but I did.
Perfect.
As a middle school teacher, I spent 8 years, and I was a reluctant convert to leadership. I loved the classroom, but I kept getting pushed into leadership. And I spent 2 years as an assistant principal, and I spent 9 years as a principal. Moving into I was a principal at 2 different schools, and I just wanted to see kids do well. And the first school I led was one of those schools where the students have so much support that it's almost impossible for them to fail. So my school was relatively successful, but it wasn't because of anything that I did. The second school I got a chance to lead was a school that had a lot of turmoil and trouble, but a staff that was willing to do the work to help turn it around. And we used the professional learning communities model popularized by the late Rick DeFore. And my staff was open and optimistic and was looking for answers. And we were able, the efficacy level was really high. But the efficacy level was high really because people didn't know any better. We were just all new at this, all wanted to do the right thing. School made so much progress, we became a national blue ribbon school. And I was the principal there between 2001 and 2007. School made so much progress, I was asked if I wanted to be a consultant, go help other schools with the professional learning community model, help them get on their feet, guide them down the road that we had already paved. And I took the challenge. And as I went to work with schools, what I found was that in some schools, the practices of improving student performance were welcomed. And in other schools, they fought me tooth and nail. And I got kind of discouraged. I kind of lost my hope. I didn't see any optimistic view of the future. And I thought that what had happened in my school was luck. Then I had an epiphany. An epiphany was, maybe it's not the potency of the practices that I'm introducing at all. Maybe it's the norms, the attitudes, the dispositions, and what they expect among the adults. So I started researching the concept of school culture because of this quandary I found myself in as a leadership consultant. And I stumbled upon the work of Dr. Kent Peterson, Professor Emeritus, University of Wisconsin. He, along with Terrence Deal, had published the work around school culture. And I contacted Dr. Peterson and I asked, were there some holes in the work? And he said, yes. And the holes that existed is that they could describe what a healthy culture, how it operated, how a toxic culture operated, but they couldn't really explain why some schools were healthy and why some schools were toxic. And that's what led me to my first book, which was Transforming School Culture. 17 schools, 34 schools in total, with schools in parallel universes with the same challenges, but one school was highly productive and the similar school was very unproductive. And I spent 3 years studying those schools to figure out what was it in one school that had the same challenges, that they were moving all the obstacles out of the way, and the other school just made excuses with the exact same challenges. So culture is a school's set of norms, meaning our habits, our attitudes, our dispositions, our beliefs, our projections for the future, all of that stuff wrapped into one, or what Michael Fuller would say, how we do things around here. And it's really a mix of 6 disciplines. And those 6 disciplines are anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, political science, and economics all rolled into one. So it is the bundle of human behavior that creates the norms of behaviors that's psychological, anthropological, sociological, that governs everything that we do. And if the culture isn't healthy, all of the technical mechanisms that we try are dead on arrival, not because they're not potentially good practices, it's because the culture or the environment in which the adults operate has created so many obstacles that progress becomes nearly impossible. So hopefully that was a thorough answer, Rick.
And thank you for that, because what we better understand each day is that often we default to the bureaucratic side of how we're supposed to operate. We look to our systems, we look to our budgets, we look to our staffing patterns, we look to our rules, our regulations for our answers. And when we're not as healthy as we should be, we try to tweak it by changing one of the policies, the procedures, the staffing pattern, introducing this program versus that program, and we never look to the people. And
absolutely,
what I hear you saying is that the toxicity or the healthiness comes from the passion and willingness of the people to help make the change, to have a common vision of what this school or organization or system that we work in, what do we hope it can be? And what we face constantly is who is responsible for that, right? Is it the principal or the superintendent or the director or the chief probation officer or the executive? Who is responsible for creating a healthy school culture or organizational culture?
The short answer would be all of the above plus. Everybody contributes to culture. And I want to demystify the difference between the changes in policies and structures, because those are important. In my work, I call those technical changes. And I describe a technical change like a seed. If you go to the farmer's market, you buy the best zucchini seed that money could buy. That seed has potential, but that potential can only be cultivated in the culture, which I call the soil. If the soil is healthy, if it's rich, if it's nourished, if it's fertilized, then it produces an environment where that seed can grow. You can't have healthy seeds or great seeds with unhealthy soil. And it makes no sense to have good soil without planting any seeds. So change is the combination of both the technical and the cultural. But what my evidence has shown is that the cultural change has to come first in order for the technical change to work. I'd like to recommend to anybody listening a book called The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. In that book, Patrick Lencioni found that organizations tend to gravitate towards the technical because they're not as dynamic. The dimensions aren't as deep. It's easy if you have authority to change your budget or to buy a new reading program or to change the master schedule. It's difficult to address subconscious racism. It's difficult to address xenophobia. It's difficult to address sexism. These are all of the things that work in an interdynamic way to create the soil. And good seeds can't transcend bad soil. The people who actually do the work have to be aligned with the tools of work, the tools that they use for their work. If that combination isn't present, then all of our investment and improvement becomes a miserable failure.
And then over time, we begin to look at those nutrients in the soil, which are the people themselves. And if we have healthy people, then we create healthy cultures, right? People who are open to change, people are open to new ideas, people that bring energy. They don't zap the energy from others. They're forward thinking. They're positive in that regard. But when you kind of look from your 30,000 foot vantage point and say, okay, here's organization A, and they have 100 people or 50 people or 1,000 people, all of a sudden you can begin to divide those people into different tribes, right? Different mindsets.
Absolutely. That's a sociological part of culture.
And you've done a remarkable job in kind of defining what those groups gravitate, what those individuals, how those individuals gravitate to these different groups that create kind of their profile that lends itself to either advancing a healthy culture or promoting the toxicity of an unhealthy culture. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit about how those groups emerge and who joins those various groups and how they become part of the subculture of what is you're hoping to create a healthy culture, but you have a series of subcultures within the system?
Absolutely. The biggest finding from the Transforming School Culture study is that people are nomadic when it comes to their ideologies and their views. And that schools are very unique institutions for a couple reasons. The first reason is that the school system was always developed for people to act as individuals. We never really had to act like an organization. That's why parents in most schools, especially in elementary schools, they lobby for their child to be placed in the teacher's classroom who they've heard has certain characteristics, because we can't guarantee that level of potency across the system. So I want Mrs. Jones or Mr. Jackson or Mrs. Smith, because I've heard from parents that if my child gets access to that person, that classroom is dynamic. So we've always acted as individuals. In classrooms, offices, we've been divided by walls. So our culture really wasn't emphasized for decades, because I was judged and assessed on what I did as a teacher in my classroom. Now we have to create a system or systems that are effective. So that's one obstacle. The other obstacle, then I'll get into the framework for transforming school culture, is that we've created an environment, especially in education, where it is sacrilegious or counterintuitive to question the behavior of a colleague that we believe is unsavory or unprofessional. It's kind of this code of silence. So the grumpy teacher who comes and dominates the teacher's lounge with vitriol and false accusations or even true accusations, who create this tense environment, often the teachers who are more positive, who want to be more pragmatic, tend to shut themselves off from that type of interaction or isolate themselves. So we created this culture where I can be unprofessional and nobody challenges my behavior, because we've had this culture of isolation. I don't have to deal with that if I don't want to. What I found is that in every school that I studied, people gravitated towards people with like worldviews or like ideologies. I created a conceptual framework. The people would gravitate in all 34 schools into one of four subcultures. And I call those subcultures the believers, the tweeners, the survivors, and the fundamentalists. It's the whole premise of the Transforming School Culture framework. Who are the believers? The believers are those educators who gravitate towards the ideology of egalitarianism, or every child being successful, as you say in your organization, Rick, no exceptions. That every child has potential to be successful, and their success is based upon the positive influence of my work the work of my colleagues. It's what John Hattie would call collective teacher efficacy, which he found had the highest effect on student learning of all 252 of the factors or variables he studied for his visible learning work. What we found was believers were positive, optimistic, willing to change, self-reflective. They were the ideal type of educator that we would need to move our systems forward. In schools that were highly effective, the believers dominated the social and political discourse in those schools. Here's what's kind of troubling, Rick, is that as we looked at all 34 schools in the study, the number of believers far outweighed the number of fundamentalists, who were those who were more adversarial. But even though the believers outnumbered fundamentalists, and in schools that were toxic, the fundamentalists could be a very small minority, but they would dominate the ideology of the organization because they were bolder, more aggressive and assertive, more confident in their interaction with others. So the biggest challenge that I make in the entire book is that believers have to have the courage to be student-centered, not just in private, but to be student-centered in their approach with those unprofessional colleagues and balance the dialogue. That if there is no positive peer pressure, negative peer pressure dominates the culture. So believers, it's just not enough to be an advocate in your isolated sense, but has to be spread across your entire system. So now it becomes the norm of the culture, not just the norm of your classroom. The second subculture we call the tweeners, and those are our new educators. They are probationary to our culture. They have the pedagogical skills and the licensure, but they don't understand how professional school cultures operate. So they tend to be neutral. If you do not have a strong group of believers, then the tweeners become easy prey to fundamentalists. They wait for opportune moments to lobby. So to any administrators who are listening, it is essential that when you bring in new people to your culture, you surround them with folks who are models for the type of professional you'd like for that person to become, and provide them with support until they become strong enough to be an influencer, positive influencer on their own. The third subculture we call the survivors. Our profession is very difficult, and reductions in budget, increase in class size, more public scrutiny has made, pushed some people over the edge who just need a strong group of support. These aren't adversarial people. These aren't people who are anti-child. They become so overwhelmed that they're just holding on with their fingernails. This is where leadership becomes important, to identify them and support them, because they're not culturally negative. They're culturally neutral, and they're almost on the way out of the door. Last but not least are the fundamentalists. Schools have historically been very adult-centered, whether it's contracts for employment, whether it's with student discipline. Educators have become accustomed to being judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to curriculum, policy, structure. And there are folks who hold on, who lament that losing a privilege, even though it's better for kids, whether it's how I teach vocabulary or how we assess, they struggle with the organization's need to improve that would suit the interests of the organization or the school for their own benefit. And they become very virulent. They recruit, they defame, they undermine, they intimidate. You can even say they bully, because they fear losing a level of control of their environment that may not be better for kids, but it's more beneficial for them personally. And they tend to do it collaboratively. And we have seen schools that are a political mess, where it's teacher against teacher, administrator against administrator. And there are people, because of their privilege, or their unwillingness to be flexible on behalf of their community and their children, who want to hold on to things that may not be better for them, but may be better for the individual or the professional. And trying to navigate those competing objectives is a very difficult job that an administrator faces. But trying to eliminate that division and creating synergy is what moves us towards being a healthy culture.
So what's remarkable about those descriptions and definitions, Anthony, and because we have a broader audience of people in education, but juvenile justice, child welfare, community-based organizations, because your model, your school model, is something we all recognize, right? We all have been through the educational system in one shape or another. It's something that we share universally amongst everybody. And then after we go through that educational system, we vary off into various professional sectors. So some of us end up in child welfare, some of us end up in health, some of us end up in law enforcement, some of us end up in the juvenile justice system. But we can all draw upon the school experience because it's a shared experience. And what strikes me again about the work is how universal it is. We can see those four profiles, no matter what sector, as long as you bring people together and are supposed to work on a common set of opportunities and challenges, as long as we bring that variable of individuals and all their histories and all their experience and all their values and all their fears together, you will see them dividing themselves into those four categories for one reason or another, right? And that's what's so amazing about the school model and its universality to all that we do. But let me take you one step further in this conversation. And that is, if you've been around for a while, if you're the director or a supervisor or an assistant or the principal or a superintendent, whatever the position may be within whatever sector you're representing, and working with a group of people, using your definition, I think the person who has some level of experience can easily, without even surveying, I can come up and ask them, how many fundamentalists do you have? How many tweeners do you have? How many survivors do you have? How many believers do you have? And once I begin to understand that, then that should trigger a strategy from me. Now, if I come back to you and I say, well, 50% of the people represented in my organization are fundamentalists, that should raise a pretty large red flag, right?
Absolutely. The same way if the teacher said 50% of my class can't read.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm your leader and half of you are dysfunctional, how do you think that dysfunction developed?
Yes. So when now you're going back, let's go transform. We've now identified, diagnosed healthy and toxicity. We have a pretty good working understanding. Now we're going to go into the transformational part of creating the school culture or organizational culture that you want. Can you walk us through how change begins to take place?
Absolutely. And I'll address it at different levels. As I mentioned, the framework, the believers, tweeners, survivors, and fundamentalists. I'd like to say to those who are not in a formal leadership position, your best tool is peer pressure. Is to be a consistent advocate for what you know as a system you're supposed to be about. So you don't have any authority over your colleagues, but you do have influence. So if you hear racist talk in the teacher's lounge, if you hear class-based bias, if you hear xenophobia or other bias, you have an obligation to speak up. What that does to your colleagues is it sends the message that you are not party. You won't be a party to that, and it helps them understand the environment they're in. But the person in the school system that has the most impact over school culture is site-based leadership, because site-based leadership sets the conditions in which people work. And what I'll cover during our webinar later in August are 4 things we learned from transforming school culture. That what were some of the common characteristics of the leaders that had strong cultures, where their believers were empowered, where they were progressive, These leaders possess four very essential skills, and they were balanced. And those four skills were communication, which represents a cognitive need. If you don't communicate with people and clearly articulate, whether it's in writing or verbally, if you can't share ideas and create a shared vision, don't be shocked if you have a split faculty. So if you're a poor communicator, that's a very strong contributor to a dysfunctional culture. Communication is how human beings interact and share ideas. The second skill is the ability to build trust, which is more of an emotional need. It's more of emotional intelligence. Can you create a meeting of the heart? Communication is about a meeting of the minds. Trust is about a connection of the heart. Can you be humane with people? Can you show empathy? Can you try to understand where they're coming from? Can you encourage? It's creating a bond of human beings. The third skill is the ability to build capacity. If I can address you cognitively, I can address you emotionally, I have to be a part of building your skill. If a person is very poor with their use of technology, don't be shocked if they get pessimistic about technology. If a person really struggles with literacy instruction, that's something as a leader I have to diagnose and then provide resources and be very specific about developing your skill level to be able to deliver on what we say we're all trying to do. And the fourth skill is one that's very important, but it can't be overused or underused. It's the willingness to use authority. And I want to tell leaders who are listening that authority is an important skill, but it's only important after you've met people's needs with their support. Authority can't be used to compensate for poor communication, lack of emotional intelligence, and lack of professional growth and development. If you've done all of those things, we found the leaders who had the courage that once they made a strong investment, to go to those people who are illogically dismissive, just have a very important heart-to-heart. You know why we're doing it. You have the skills to do it. We trust each other. You have the resources. At some point, those who are illogically oppositional, a leader has to be willing to say, at this point, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. Once we've reached a consensus on the best direction for our institution, people who just say, you can't make me, I call them the over my dead body people. A leader has to be willing to say that improvement is not a suggestion. It's a requirement. And that person, that small group of people will be outliers to the rest of the system. And at some point, a leader has to be willing to use authority where it's situationally appropriate to either force people on the bus or show them a different direction. But I wanted to reiterate, that skill only comes after you've made the proper investments and supports to help people reach the level of performance that we expect, not before.
And when asked, when we do a webinar or a workshop or a class, what are the tools in our toolkit? What are the tools in our tool chest? You just outlined 4 of those. And everything else supports those 4 elements, those 4 essential skills. So thank you for making that so clear, so articulating it so effectively that it gives me the direction I need. And again, understanding its universality, those are the same for, I see, whatever sector that we represent in terms of serving our young people becomes powerful. I have to share a quick story because in our quest of understanding, which drove our work from day one, is why do some kids do well and other kids struggle? And although sometimes we think we have a simple answer to that, the answers are really a lot more complex. And we try to limit that answer to, well, kids who have come from more risky situations have more difficulties than kids who come from less risky situations, and yet we found too many exceptions to that rule, that some kids came
Absolutely.
from horrific conditions and still were quite successful. So it didn't seem like it had a down and dirty answer, but we wanted to understand it. When we understood the power of culture in making that difference, that we worked so long in trying to create the right bureaucracies, but not giving equal time or attention to the right cultures or even understanding what culture was, we began to refocus our attention on using culture as a service delivery mechanism, not just another program or curriculum or process, right? And we went to and curiously, Anthony, we went to the U.S. Military Academy. And the reason we chose the U.S. Military Academy is because it had a very well-defined bureaucracy, much better defined bureaucracy than the U.S. Military Academy. Maybe the Vatican would be close, but we didn't have enough money to go to the Vatican, so we chose the U.S. Military Academy, and we understood intuitively, and then of course cognitively, how they describe their structure. Very, very powerful, very simple. But we were equally interested in what their culture, how they could define their culture. And the superintendent of the academy said, well, that's pretty simple. Our culture is defined by this expression. It's a military code of conduct at West Point. We don't lie, steal, nor cheat, nor do we tolerate anyone who does. And when I heard you describing, not only authority as one of the skill sets, but equal to that, the profiles of the different groups that we gravitate to, the fundamentalists being one of those, that we don't lie, steal, nor cheat, nor do we tolerate anyone who does. And to that point is, we don't give up on kids, nor do we tolerate anyone who does. It's us taking responsibility for the culture. The bureaucracy lends itself out to the hierarchy of top to bottom and bottom to top, but the culture is more flattened out, that we all are responsible for the culture. So I just wanted to share that with you. We have probably about 20 minutes left, and I don't want to shortchange you. If there's a theme or thought you want to share before we go to questions and answers, please do so. If you're ready for Q&A, we're ready for that as well.
Just a short commentary on kind of the events of the last couple of weeks and how that relates to creating hope in schools and in children, and also culture. There's a quote by Nelson Mandela that I think is just so powerful. He wrote that the world's problems begin with the belief that some human lives are more valuable than others. The cry for justice, the cry for equity, is as natural to the human being as the breath that we take. Nobody was born to feel superior. Nobody was born to feel inferior. But when cultures and systems produce these hierarchies, as Mandela said, our problems begin when some groups of people take the stance that who I am and where I'm from and what I represent is more valuable than who you are, where you're from, and what you represent. And that creates tension. And that tension leads to an imbalance. It leads to struggle. It leads to conflict. School should not be a place that mirror that. So I want you to think about the hierarchies and the messages in our schools that send that message. Do we have a low track and a high track? Do we have exclusive opportunities for some kids that other kids don't get access to? Do we have disproportionality or systemic discrimination in our policies and our code of conduct and our rules and our structure? That it's easy to look outside and see these protests in the street and say, wow, that's terrible, it's happening out there. But schools are a microcosm of our greater society. And the systemic oppression that people are fighting externally, I'm asking people who are listening to have that same level of vigor and introspection when we look at how we operate as schools and how we operate as systems and organizations.
Thank you for framing it the way you did, because that gives us an insight. If we can change the cultures in which we operate each day, live, and work, then the larger culture should be able to follow that, because life's lessons learned about that. But if we can't even create our institutions to have that same sense of value that you just described, then there's no chance for the greater society or community to become what we expected, and therefore it becomes vulnerable to what we saw a couple of weeks ago with Mr. Floyd. So,
absolutely. When
kids
are walking through metal detectors, they're getting shaken down in schools. They're made to feel like criminals. They're handled in a harsh manner, and we wonder why the kids vandalize the school and leave garbage everywhere. That's what we're seeing at a larger scale that happens in schools all the time.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have probably about 15 minutes, Anthony. I'm going to turn this portion over to Kim, who's going to moderate the Q&A the queue that's been coming up, and we'll participate in the A part of that. So Kim, this is your moment to shine.
That's right. I have the Q's if you have the A's.
Okay.
The first question comes from Shelley. Shelley asks, Dr. Muhammad, do you believe that a person can only be in one of the subcultures, or that a person can be a part of two or more? For example, a tweener can also be a believer.
Okay. Great question. Now you go beyond belief. The way the framework was set up is that we identified people on our framework based upon their objective. And that as you operate in the professional environment, that you don't have competing objectives. So a tweener is somebody, it's not based upon how you view reality. It's based upon the newness and the introduction into the culture. So a tweener is probationary in the culture. They don't understand the culture yet. Now, tweeners tend to have the DNA to become believers. But if you think back to your introduction into education or whatever profession you're part of, you are in your formative years, the first 2 to 4 years. You're kind of understanding how things worked around here. But you had an idea before you came. The health of that system to shape you and mold those ideas into a reality is a great determining factor into how you practice for the rest of your career. So being a tweener doesn't mean you're neutral. It means you're new to the system, and you're trying to figure out how things operate. We found that takes about 2 to 4 years. Now, you can't be a believer and a survivor or a fundamentalist at the same time. What defines people on my framework is their objective. The behavior is shaped by the objective. What am I trying to accomplish? And the objective of a believer is success for my students. And what would that mean? I will do whatever it takes. My behavior will justify my objective. Well, if you say you're a believer and there's clear evidence that something is better for kids, you say, no, I'm just not doing it because you can't make me. Well, then you're just you're a fundamentalist masquerading as a believer. So your objective and what you're trying to accomplish, we see it justified by your behavior. Well, if I'm a fundamentalist, and I don't care how many kids failed pre-algebra or algebra, I'm not changing how I teach. I'm not doing an intervention class, not because I don't see that it's potentially better for kids. It's not more comfortable for me. So I like to call the fundamentalist a me first as opposed to a we first individual. So if you work in a system and your first thought is, how does this best serve me? Then you're a fundamentalist. That doesn't make you a bad person. It just means your professional impact has been compromised. If you think, how is this potentially better for kids? And that's the lens you look at your work. You look at your work, then you're a believer. Your behavior will always be aligned with what's best for kids. So no, you can't be multi-categorical. But I want you to, the framework isn't a scarlet letter. It's not, you don't walk around with the shame of a fundamentalist. It's a mirror for people to look in and to be self-reflective and introspective about, is my behavior better for kids, or am I an impediment to kids' development? It's for people to have a personal aha moment. It's not a Myers-Briggs personality assessment.
It's amazing how so much of what you're sharing with us and other speakers who have brought expertise to our forums have shared with us, how it dovetails into a common understanding of who we are in a genuine, authentic way. If we're genuine and authentic for ourselves, we will be genuine and authentic for others. But if we're trying to mask who we are, pretend that we're someone that we're not, playing different roles for different people, then in fact, that is very obvious, and it doesn't help the larger cause. Our friend Charlie Applestein, who works with us like you do, Anthony, would say at the end of the day, he doesn't always judge himself on how well he did with the kids he worked with, is how well he did for how he perceived himself in a genuine, authentic way. He's judging himself on his behavior, and if he is true to who he is, it seems to work out better for the kids.
Absolutely. And you'll make mistakes, but you made a mistake in the journey to do better for kids. And I want to say to the person who asked that question is that don't confuse being resistant or having some apprehensions with being a fundamentalist. If there is a suggestion made about improvement that you just can't intellectually grasp is going to be better for kids, then you're duty bound as a believer to resist. So a believer will resist not because it's not better for me personally, it's not better for kids. And a fundamentalist can resist not because it's not better for kids, I'm resisting because it's not more comfortable for me.
Yep. Thank you for that. Thank you. Kim?
Yes. So our next question is anonymous, but it says, since COVID-19, my staff have been very supportive with each other. I become overwhelmed when they share knowledge and coach one another. I believe this remote learning has humbled us all. I want to sustain these behaviors. What are some techniques that will help us continue to nurture one another and not compete with each other? Great question.
Is to celebrate the collaboration. Celebration is an anthropological concept, and anthropologists identify that what we celebrate is what we value. So I'd ask that anonymous person to take a look at in your school, what do you celebrate? Do you celebrate individualism, or do you celebrate collective effort? So when you celebrate, it sends a message that this is what we value. Like you celebrate a birthday. You celebrate because that person is important to you. So if people have really gravitated towards being humane, being collaborative, sharing, being student-centered, the more you celebrate and acknowledge it, now it becomes an expectation in the culture. So I would use that as leverage to reinforce it, celebrate it, acknowledge it, and help people recognize that this is how we should practice in general. You'll get much more out of celebrating good behavior than condemning bad behavior.
Thank you. Kim?
Okay. Our friend Trish Stollard up in Washington State has a question. Trish asks, how can a principal influence other principals and then the district office? Essentially, how do we lead from the bottom up?
Okay. When it comes to systems, I would highly recommend Michael Fullen's book, Coherence. And healthy systems are aligned from top to bottom, what their core values are, etc. And it's led best from top to bottom. But you can influence from bottom up. The only thing that a bottom-up approach lacks is authority. But you can influence. You can influence up, you don't have any authority up. So sharing, making suggestions, asking to be a pilot, proposing alternative ideas. Quick example. When I was a new principal, my school had a lot of climate issues, safety issues. And I had a superintendent who really wanted to push service learning. And it wasn't that service learning wasn't good or wasn't valuable, it just wasn't something we could use at that point. So instead of bad-mouthing my superintendent or going to colleagues to vent, I approached him and I acknowledged the power of service learning, but I asked if we could be a pilot and try something different, and we'd get back to service learning. So he listened, I laid out the logic, we tried a different approach. It was very successful. And then many other schools in our district emulated our approach because I wanted to do more of a mentoring-based, positive-based system of student support to really influence their behavior and their self-efficacy. And for my school, I just did think service learning was the best approach for us at that point. So I would recommend the same way you would expect a good teacher to express alternative perceptions or doubt in a way that's respectful, that's productive. I would ask the principal to take that same approach with district office. The district office has no vested interest in your district failing. They want to be successful just like you. So if you see or you witness something, establish that line of communication where you can provide ideas, alternatives, try pilots, do a little action research, and be kind of the cheerleader of the us versus the me mentality and create that we mentality.
I think the paradigm that we're talking about in terms of bureaucracy being really the top-down way of making change happen, and the culture creating an opportunity for the bottom-up to make change happen. One has authority, the other has remarkable influence, but I think the point you made is that influence really requires a little bit more effort in terms of aligning people with common ideas, so you have a greater power base in which to work forward, work towards. I think we're seeing that played out in real time again in our country with Mr. Floyd's horrible experience and what that has meant to us at a visceral level. But if one of us went to the power structure and tried to make the change, we could be easily dismissed. But when you have thousands of us, hundreds of thousands of us, millions of us demanding some change, then for survival purposes, if nothing else, authority has to pay attention to us. And that can be modeled at various levels. It's when we feel alone, you cannot have a culture of one. Once you understand you can't have a culture of one, then you begin to understand the inherent power that you have in aligning others with common goals and objectives and using that collective efficacy, as you point out, to make the change. So it can happen. And again, great appreciation for you to helping us better understand that. Kim?
Yep, lots of really important questions coming through, and we're going to get to as many as we can. We only have about 5 minutes left, but
Kim usually says that when I talk too long, Anthony, so I'm going to have to kind of zip up and let you kind of run with the ball a little bit more.
Anthony's doing a very good job of very concise answers.
Yes, I'm learning a lot from him.
Okay. So this is anonymous again. When trying to change the culture in a school surrounding racist language that's being used by students with one another and is seen as quote unquote normal everyday language, how do we change students' use of such language and change that normal for them? Even with history lessons, racist terms are being accepted by all students regardless of race as the norm, which is very disconcerting.
Okay. Well, that's a complex question with a complex answer. There's a science called sociolinguistics, which is a science how language develops in culture. And often I hear teachers use that with African-American students using the N-word with each other. All language is contextual. I have friends who are gay, and there are certain things that they'll say to each other that not being heterosexual would be very offensive to them if I said the same thing. So don't look at a student's interaction with each other using terms that you don't have access to use as them using racist terminology. Particularly when a group loses authority, one of the things that they can control is language. And one of the things that the African-American community did was turn the N-word internally from a racist term to a term of endearment within the community. All language is contextual. So if it's students of different races using racial slurs against one another in a way to hurt each other and to cause pain, that's an issue of student respect, and that shouldn't be tolerated. Now, students' use of N-word with each other in school, that may be acceptable in their household, but you have to draw a line of what can be acceptable at school, but don't judge it as racist. It just may not be appropriate for your particular context. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. Flint's 85% African American. There are things that my friends and I say to each other that somebody outside of our group could not say. That's just linguistics. That's the connection of sociology and linguistics. There's a lot of dynamics to that. But if you're creating an environment that's multicultural where people respect each other's culture, a couple of ideas. Number one, you have to give cultural representation equal distribution in your curriculum. You cannot marginalize some people's culture to a month or an event, and then other people's culture dominates the entire curriculum. Kids recognize that imbalance. So I highly recommend checking out Dr. Shiraki Holly's book, Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching and Learning. How to create a culturally and linguistically balanced environment so that every kid feels, as Dr. Holly would call it, validated and affirmed. When it comes to hate speech, that's as cut and dry as sexual harassment. You just can't do it. But help kids understand why it's hurtful, why they can't do it, and don't overreact to language groups that develop because of social linguistics and perceive it as hateful because you can't use that language, but it's perfectly okay for students to use it with each other. That's more of an inappropriate in this environment, not necessarily hateful. That's a pretty big question you asked. It's difficult to answer in a few minutes.
Pretty big question. You could probably do a 6-hour workshop just on that thought and question
alone. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Kim, we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I promise I won't participate. Let Anthony answer those. So if you have 1 or 2 more for him,
okay,
that would be great.
Yep. Dr. Muhammad, you are working diligently at developing the seed and soil technical and cultural change. How long have you seen as typical to change a school culture? At your 2 schools, how long did it take to change the culture? What is too short or too long in school culture turnaround?
Great question. I get that question a lot, and it's contextual again. It really depends on how toxic your culture is. Our march towards improvement happened relatively quickly because my school culture we were ineffective. Our biggest problem was our practice. It wasn't our culture. So if there's some disagreement, personality conflicts, a good leader can heal those wounds in a year. But if there's deep systemic, deep historical conflict and culture of pessimism, it could take up to 3. But I like to answer that question like you'd ask a health professional. How long does it take to become healthy? It depends on how sick you are. If I have a common cold, it could be 2 weeks. If I have cancer, stage 2 or stage 3 cancer, it might take 2 months of chemo and 6 months of recovery. It really just depends on how deep the issues are. It's a difficult question to answer with assurance.
I think you gave us a little bit of a clue in terms of those 4 profiles, the tweeners, the fundamentalists, the survivors, and the believers, is understanding what percentage of your people are believers and what percentage are fundamentalists, etc. Will give you a good clue of how sick you may be. So I think that's a pretty powerful framework. Kim, 1 more quick question.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions on how we can navigate building culture successfully when we are operating in a distance learning environment?
You establish relationships through virtually in ways that you would do physically. I can recommend someone if they can email me at info@newfrontier21.com. One of our colleagues, Regina Owens, led a very successful virtual learning environment in Texas and created a very strong learning community. I can transfer your information to her, and she can give you a much more in-depth answer than I could. But the only thing that's different is that you don't have the face-to-face human interaction. So you have to figure out ways to develop that with alternative means that you don't get the access to face-to-face.
Thank you, Anthony. So I'm going to thank you from the bottom of our collective hearts for joining us under technologically difficult circumstances. We still made it happen. You were loud and clear from my perspective. I hope that was true for everybody else. Your enthusiasm and insights come over whether you're in person or virtually. So that was a great example of who you are and what you represent. So that wasn't lost. And whether you were just on audio or virtually or in person, I've had the benefit of seeing you in all different types through all different types of platforms. I want to remind everybody that I have the opportunity to spend, and you do as well, to spend 3 hours with Anthony and a couple bonus webinars afterwards, beginning on August the 7th. And we're going to open up registration pretty quick on that. There's going to be a small registration fee, but our commitment is nobody's denied the opportunity to participate in anything Kids Hope does because of a cost factor. So you just let us know. We'll find ways to make sure that happens. We'll stretch people's resources, but we want you to join us on August the 7th. We want you to encourage your colleagues to join us. The more we participate in this joint conversation rather than just onesies or twosies, the greater opportunity to hear the same message, the same principles, the same practices collectively gives us a head start on school transformation, organizational transformation, agency transformation. So let's take advantage of the August 7th opportunity with Dr. Mohammed. I think it's going to be spectacular, and I really want you to begin to think and save that date and time for us to join with you and with Dr. Mohammed on that very powerful discussion. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Anthony, continue to be safe and vigilant for you and your family, and we'll look forward to intersecting with you very, very soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, Rick, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Everybody else, keep your seatbelt fastened. We're going to stick together. We're going to continue to travel at the speed of hope, even during these difficult circumstances. Take good care. Bye-bye.